A frequent theme in the interviews that I do with global energy experts is that regulatory regimes really matter. If we're talking about expanding energy production, or if we're talking about, the introduction, the adoption of new clean energy technologies like wind and solar, battery storage, you have to get the policy and the regulatory framework right. Otherwise, you run into problems. So I'm going to talk to Shahid Mahdi, who is the product manager of EnerKnol, and their platform provides access to regulatory proceedings and other information across North America and across various types of energy. We're going to be talking about trends in energy regulation. So welcome to the interview.
Markham, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
Look, give me your general take on where energy regulation is going in the United States and Canada.
Absolutely. So it's been a feverishly dizzying time for energy regulation in terms of a federal, state, and local level. A lot of it is a consequence of the linchpin Biden administration acts. So whether it's the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act from 2021, followed by its spiritual successor, if you will, the Inflation Reduction Act of 22, and then combined with the CHIPS and Science Act, those three acts provide for $135 billion within particularly renewable energy across infrastructure, transmission, planning, cyber resilience, again, some topics that I'm sure we'll get into today. And so what we're seeing at EnerKnol is really an unprecedented push of our users, whether they're in the law firm world, the financial world, academia, or of course, utilities and energy companies themselves, scrambling to really stay apprised of all these bills, dockets, proceedings that are just pumping out every day. Because so many states, red and blue, are trying to leverage the incentives, the tax breaks, this ushering in a green revolution and really just taking advantage of all the provisions that these acts are enacting.
So we've got regulation at the federal level, and it's a little different in Canada and the U.S.
Sure.
The U.S. has the FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Canada doesn't have we have the Canada Energy Regulator, but it has a much more limited role than FERC does, and the power over energy regulation really resides in the provinces. How is that split up in the U.S. between the federal government, the state governments, and local governments?
That's a really fascinating, almost Hamiltonian versus Jeffersonian debate there. Now, in many instances, we see the states take a foot and say, well, we're not going to defer to the government. Now, one great anecdote is the notion of renewable portfolio standards. So long story short, certain states say, look, by year X, we are going to generate Y% of our energy through purely renewable means. And what's interesting is the bluer the state, the more aggressive that agenda is. So naturally, California, New York, et cetera, many states on the East Coast tend to lead this in terms of carbon emission targets, whereas states like Montana actually repealed their portfolio standards, saying, hey, we don't want to, it was in the legislative chamber for a while, but we don't want to adhere to this larger renewable agenda. Now, of course, there are a lot of nuances and there's a lot of opportunity in all states, red and blue, but I think that opens up a really fascinating debate about, to what extent does FERC and the Biden administration, of course, having passed these bills that even in his recent State of the Union speech, he celebrated many times as being bipartisan, to what extent are those going to foot over what the states do? Now, another very quick example is the notion of the transmission operators. So in 2021, we saw Texas battered by Winter Storm Uri and really tragic circumstances, people dying, water pipes being frozen, et cetera. And it raised a lot of eyebrows saying, well, if Texas joined the rest of the wider U.S. exoskeleton transmission-wide and didn't have this, isolationist ERCOT body, would things have been different? And now that has been something that has been debated ad nauseum at FERC and at NERC and many other agencies. So it's a super interesting topic.
So even in the few minutes that we've been talking, it's become apparent that there is a tangled web of regulations for any energy company, maybe not on the oil and gas side so much, because those tend to be regulated by, like in Texas, the Texas Railroad Commission. They have state level regulators. But for instance, if you're in clean energy, transmission has become a huge issue, and upgrading the grid, which outside of Texas generally crosses state lines. And so, are you seeing an uptick in the customers that you're talking about trying to get their hands on the implications of all of these regulations at the various levels of government in the US?
Absolutely. So I think implications is the perfect word, because I think as a lot of our customers notice when they dive into the platform, for example, the advent of renewable technology comes with a lot of baggage. Now, whether it's updating the grid, ensuring that battery infrastructure is up to par for a mass electrification of school buses and UPS trucks, it's a real multi-pronged process from A to Z to make sure the renewable future that the Biden administration is pushing, and a lot of states are pushing, is one that can seamlessly be transitioned to without a loss of efficiency, without a loss of functionality. And of course, it's not a cheap process either. So a lot of, for example, transmission operators and grids have issued massive requests for proposal on advice and consultation on various projects, how to economize their initiatives as well. And so a lot of docket proceedings that customers have been tracking revolve around this, the best business opportunity to, yes, the long-term lucrative opportunity of the renewable push may pay dividends, but in the here and now, it's not really that easy a process to update the entire grid, as you said, or to switch all the trucks overnight to electric vehicles, et cetera, et cetera. Now, of course, federal financing is available. Again, the acts have provisioned more than $20 billion, but to see how that's dispersed is going to be super interesting.
Now, you also have Canadian customers. So what kind of trends are you seeing in Canada, particularly those that might be a little different than what we're seeing in the United States?
Sure. So a lot of the Canadian trends, interestingly, I'll focus on one in particular, have been around hydrogen. Now, Canada is, of course, as you mentioned, a very different sort of set of kingdoms where a lot more of the power revolves around the provinces as opposed to a FERC. And some of our Canadian customers have found that leads to a higher level of efficiency and maybe less bureaucracy when it comes to going through the rulemaking process. Now, obviously, there have been a lot of developments around the kind of inter-US Canada pipelines. A lot of people have been intrigued in tracking those. And cybersecurity, interestingly, has been an issue that is starting to percolate. We saw it in the US, but also across Canada now, in terms of not only maintaining the hardware of the pipeline, but safeguarding the IT and the software of the pipelines has become a really interesting topic. And I think globally, this will be a topic that a lot of agencies will try to push in terms of what standards do these pipelines have to abide to. So those are, I would say, hydrogen and cybersecurity, two quick topics that are starting to percolate in Canada for sure.
So my take on this is that we've got two essentially, we've got a threat that has accelerated, cybersecurity, that is evolving at a fast pace. We've got hydrogen, which is essentially a new energy source, since we're talking on the scale that we're talking about it. So that requires a lot of regulation. And are the states and provinces doing a good job of streamlining or making the regulatory process efficient?
They're doing a good job. I think it's an interesting question of quality versus quantity. So the quantity is there, and in terms of the Canadian and American legislative bodies, they are pumping out rulemaking that is pertinent to cybersecurity, whether it's training, whether it's making people aware, whether it's just notifying people of what to do in terms of crises. That public disclosure seems to be in abundance. Now, what is a bit more intangible is this idea of, well, how is the private sector, trying to account for this? Because there's only so much the government can push. Yes, there are rulemaking standards, but as we saw with Colonial Pipeline, it really comes down to the private sector acting out of instinct or nuance in those very, frankly, scary situations. So I think that'll be interesting to see that push and pull eventually, is my conjecture, between the public and private sectors as to how do they reconcile these cyber standards, because it really is an indiscriminate threat, whether it's the password to the pipeline or whether it's people's bank account information on the customer side. It's certainly a nefarious threat with a lot of legs.
So what is it that your customers are looking for on your platform, Shahid?
Sure.
Is it access to regulatory proceedings? Is it access to the regulations themselves? Is it just give us a little taste of that, if you wouldn't mind?
Absolutely, yeah. I think it, as we've discussed, it really spans a wide range of sources. So our goal is to basically consolidate the energy universe into one central search engine. So whether it's, again, tracking the linchpin acts of the Biden administration, or tracking a specific docket proceeding in a tiny town in Texas that might have massive ramifications for a software company data center being built. The point is, what we span is pretty impressive, and so our goal across many years is to iterate that search engine to be as specific as possible. Now, internationally, there were obviously a lot of searches around Russia and Ukraine, the pipeline implications there. And then we're also seeing this interesting, slightly pertinent to cyber, this conversation around AI and how that will be legislated. In the past few days, it's been such a breakneck story. The large language models, ChatGPT, Bard, et cetera, how are they going to affect the labor market within energy? How are they going to promote cybersecurity initiatives within energy? The speed at which customers jump onto these things to, again, especially in the finance world, to be able to speculate and avoid risk is really outstanding. So across the board, we're seeing a lot of activity around, going into 2023, what are the main trends on the infrastructure front, as well as how are we going to protect all this?
So is it fair to say, this is not an astute observation on my part to say that the pace of energy technology development and adoption has been accelerating now for some time. And it seems like we passed the inflection point for a lot of these technologies like wind and solar and electric vehicles and batteries and so on. So it seems like, everything's just going faster and faster and faster. And I can see where that would lead to a regulatory nightmare as regulators try to catch up, and the private, the private sector tries to catch up to the regulators. Are we doing a good job of getting the regulation right in a very uncertain, disruptive time, or not?
I think we're doing a good job of getting the regulation out there. I think people have been stringent in terms of latching on to these incentives, tax breaks, provisions of the linchpin acts that are able to, again, I think, empower a lot of construction and infrastructure, making infrastructure more robust, for lack of better words. The problem that we do encounter is likely around the notion of just being able to keep up with all this, which again is where EnerKnol comes in, the ability to just stay apprised of dockets, bills, et cetera. Because from 2010 to 2020, the amount of legislation and dockets produced by legislative bodies per day has more than quadrupled. And so in a world where, again, also things have become just much more digitized since 2010. So now you are able to go onto the New York Public Service Commission website, but the point is, how are you going to be able to track that? So I think we've hit an interesting, as you mentioned, inflection point in terms of getting the regulation out there. But I think, to regress to my previous point, it's interesting to see how the private sector is going to adopt to it and how slow or fast they are, because there's a lot around even ESG metrics that is a bit unclear as to what people have to abide to. But then there's also this larger goal of, okay, well, there are these renewable portfolio targets, so let's try and stick to them as soon as possible.
Well, Shahid, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate your insights.
Thank you so much, Markham. It's a pleasure, and appreciate your time as well.